If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
You are listening to MINDSHOCK, the most mind-shocking podcast out there, tackling topics the mainstream doesn't want to touch with logic and reason at the forefront. Today we're going to take a look on whether or not the collapse of Hollywood, whatever you want to call it, is inevitable. In the wake of the strike and basically what has been an internet revolution whose ripples started way back when, somewhere around 2000, and that have turned into basically tsunamis at this point in terms of effect to the Hollywood industry. And we will discuss all of that in typical Mind Shock fashion. If you find the podcast interesting and informative, want to help support it, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Help bring logic and reason back to a world where it is quickly becoming extinct, as is obviously evident every time you go outside or turn on the idiot box. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel that way. Make sure you're subscribed. Hit that bell for notifications. If you're still not getting them, just like and comment on more videos. That's how the YouTube algorithm works. Otherwise, you won't get them even if you have everything enabled. Like and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patreon's a good priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast requests. You could also be a guest in the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. All right, so yeah, yet another strike. Actors, these multi-millionaires mostly are complaining that they're not getting enough millions. So this is kind of a weird thing because on one hand, obviously the studio execs, if they're pocketing the lion's share, but they're the ones putting up the money. Now, you can say that there's a huge disparity whenever, let's say, it's a non-high paid actor. I mean, they actually might have a bone to pick. They might have a legitimate point. But a lot of times, these actors that are raking in millions upon millions of dollars, they're the ones complaining that they're not getting an extra million or whatever they're complaining about. So, yeah, I'm not saying they don't deserve it before all the goofs jump on that. The Dunning-Kruger crowd, of course, loves this channel. But without them, it wouldn't even exist. So no problem there. The Dunning-Kruger goofs can keep listening and commenting. It's all good. Educational purposes with comedy. It all goes together. So what are the problems here in general? Because what I alluded to in the intro also is obviously the internet changed the game. Now, isn't necessarily piracy per se. For people that were on the internet, I mean, if for those that remember, there was a new codec that came out. It was called DivX, D-I-V-X. Now, this codec kind of changed the game because it was able to compress large files. Because keep in mind, in the late 90s, early 2000s, internet speed was not quite fast. You had your 56K modems were popular. Some people didn't even have those. Some people had even half that or other connections, just extremely slow. And there were also these things called ISDN modems. They were faster. They were basically double the speed, around 112 kilobits per second, which is basically nothing. So you couldn't really download even a DVD. A DVD is what, 4 gigabytes or something? 4.7 gigabytes or so. So you couldn't, how long would that take to download on a 56K modem? So there were also the peer-to-peer file sharing. I mean, that was around. I mean, people remember Napster and all that. I mean, a song is a couple megabytes or less for low quality. And that would still take a decent amount of time. That's not it. I mean, today, obviously, high-speed internet, you could download that in one click. By the time your finger leaves the mouse button, you can download a song. But back then, it could still take 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, a few hours, depending on who was online and the speed and all that. Some people left their computers on 24/7 for a month to get a song if it was a rare song and people weren't online that were sharing it. Now with movies, how does that work? How are you going to download a 4 gigabyte file? Or even if you copy if you digitize a VHS, the file size is not going to be tiny back then. You had WMV, Windows Media had a codec, and then there was a Real Player. I mean, really low quality stuff. But for a full movie, how are you going to download that? So when DivX came out, it just revolutionized the game. You could actually get a full movie from a DVD. So you could compress over 4 gigabytes to roughly 700 megabytes under a gigabyte, or even less, the smaller file size. You can get it down to 3, 4, 500 megabytes. And it would still take quite some time to download. It could take a couple days, whatever, a week. But you could actually burn it on a CD instead of a DVD, because obviously when DVDs first came out, they didn't really have DVD recording drives. And I don't even know who remembers this. I mean, I don't know what the age of the listeners are here. But back in them days, I mean, I think people are familiar with the floppy drive, the floppy disk that was roughly 3 megabytes. 3 point something megabytes. So you could fit, let's say, one song on there. And then there were things called zip drives, which are a lot bigger. Like they had them up to, I think, 150 megabytes or even 300, depending on if there were bigger drives. I don't remember. Those were popular for just a couple years, not too long. But the bottom line is speeds were slow, and it wasn't until the DivX codec came out. So it wasn't that the internet basically cut into Hollywood's profits, allegedly. So the other issue is, of course, people who downloaded movies back then, I guess even now, if people still do that, obviously streaming changed the game again. But I would say a large percentage of downloaders were from foreign countries. They might not even have a movie theater nearby. They might not even have a store that sells DVDs, because we're talking before Amazon became what it is today, before ordering movies, DVDs online, before streaming, all that. So one of the only ways they could get the movie is by downloading it illegally. So there was no option. I mean, Russia was really big. I guess it still is. There's a few countries that are it's really big for lack of other options at the time. Now, as with Napster, the famous Metallica lawsuit and all that, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell the exact percentage, because some people who would not have bought the album, they downloaded the song for free, listened to it, they liked it so much that they went out and bought the album. Now, I'm not saying that that's the majority. I'm saying it's hard to determine the exact percentages, and some people would have never bought the album anyway. So how do you lose money when someone who wouldn't have bought it anyway downloads it? That's the main question. And that's the case for a lot of movies, too. I mean, they used to just tape the movie off TV with their VCR, their VHS player, video home system. I might have to do a dedicated podcast, maybe with Johnny Mills. Johnny knows all about those old formats. And they actually had high def on VHS as well. There's a lot of interesting things. I think it was called DVHS, digital VHS or something like that. There were a lot of interesting things going on in the late 90s in terms of technologies and what won out. I mean, the old Betamax versus VHS and laser discs were still around. That's a topic for another podcast. But in tackling the Hollywood issue and whether or not piracy factored into the decline, I mean, obviously it did, but to what extent? I mean, I don't know if it's possible to answer that, because one could argue. Now, I haven't looked at all the exact figures, but in terms of Netflix and streaming services, I mean, how much more money would studios be making if streaming services did not exist? Because then everyone would have to shell out the full price for a Blu-ray disc, DVD, whatever, because there wouldn't be an option to just pay a flat fee per month and watch a whole bunch of different movies and TV shows. You'd have to buy the physical disc. So I'm postulating that move is really what made the profits go down. And then obviously internet piracy, there's a certain hit that they took, sure, no question. Now, exactly how substantial that was, I don't know if that's even possible to quantify. I think 70% was being thrown out by the studios, but I think that even got laughed out of court at one point. I'm not 100% sure whether that was music or movies, but I believe it was alleged that they were losing 70% profit, which obviously wasn't true just based on the numbers alone. Because if they were making, let's say, whatever, 100 million on something the year before, now they're making 90 million. That's not a 70% cut, you know? So, like, obviously, whatever they were trying to pull, they were trying to make it look more substantial than it was. Let's say it's a 10% hit or even a 20% hit. Is that really enough to completely destroy the industry? Now, couple that with streaming. Now, how much are they losing? I'm going to postulate that the digital revolution and high-speed internet and streaming services was the proverbial nail in the coffin. Because now you have people paying for streaming services instead of buying the physical discs, which obviously the physical discs are more expensive to manufacture. But on the other hand, the profit margin is also a lot bigger because the discs are being sold. I mean, literally one disc could be a monthly membership. Now, if somebody's watching 10, 20 movies that they otherwise would have bought or even rented. Now, see, the rental is where it gets a little dicey because you could still rent them digitally on Amazon or whatever for probably about the same price that it would have cost you to rent at Blockbuster or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, it's a multifaceted issue for declining profits, but let's get out of the technical mumbo jumbo and let's get into the decline in quality. So this is a huge issue because less people are going to the movie theaters, and a lot of that's economic based too when inflation is just getting out of control. I mean, the first thing that gets cut are the leisure activities. So people that might have gone to the movies every single week, are there still people that go to the movie every weekend? Because back in the day, that was kind of a thing. A lot of people went to the movies almost every weekend. I mean, I don't know, maybe it kind of depends on where you live, but I remember in 90s, early 2000s, going to the movies was a thing. It was like going out to eat. You could do it once or even twice a week, and people did it every week. Now, I'm sure there's probably people who still do that and go to the movies every weekend, but I would bet that number is much, much smaller than before. Again, due to a variety of factors. One of them is economical. Another one is just the drop in quality. Like, there used to be a lot of good movies coming out. Now, I mean, Hollywood is what, 99% garbage now? I mean, it's almost pure, unadulterated trash, and that's even without factoring in political agendas and all that woke nonsense. That's without even factoring that in. Because even movies that aren't really heavy on the propaganda, they're still just terrible. They have no soul. And that's kind of, I'm actually going to talk about that on a few other podcasts. And I'll go over what made 80s and 90s movies so good. And the rewatchability factor. I mean, look at movies made in the past 10 years. I mean, obviously there've been some good ones that have, there've been some good ones here and there, but not a lot. Whereas if you look at just so many movies made in the 80s and 90s, even if they're not great, or even if they're garbage compared to other movies in that time period, the rewatchability factor. And I argue that's because back then people had pride in their work. And even if a movie was kind of bad, it still had soul, which made it entertaining in a way that modern movies just really aren't, other than a few here and there. And the ones that are, a lot of them play up a nostalgia factor, or maybe have some kind of connection to other, to previous era actors or events. I mean, how much truly brand new original stuff is coming out nowadays? It's mostly garbage. So all of these factors together obviously are contributing to the fall of Hollywood and the decline. Some people say, I mean, going woke was Hollywood was always woke. It's just they kind of sort of could pretend. And some of it wasn't even pretend because there were movies that were anti-woke. I mean, even big movies, so to speak. Now, they always snuck stuff in, and if you haven't checked out the Predictive Programming podcast on MINDSHOCK, they would always sneak in some propaganda garbage, even into big movies. I mean, to the point where To the point where you could even argue some of the lead actors didn't even know what was being stuffed into the agenda in random movies. But it was downplayed enough, it was subtle enough where it didn't really necessarily prevent people from seeing a movie, especially if they didn't know that was in it. Whereas nowadays, like, the nostalgia factor, I mean, you could argue that Hollywood is hanging by a thread on nostalgia factor alone. And this ever shrinking demographic that's actually willing to spend money on Hollywood trash, they're spitting in the face of of one of their last demographics by just destroying franchises and beloved films of the past with just these nonsense remakes where they just spit on everything that they're built on. And I mean, some people could argue it's all by design and it's all part of just a grand collapse. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole for the moment. I'm just going to address the inevitable collapse because the last point of all of this are how the internet also gave rise to so-called social media influencers, YouTubers, whatever. It's actually kind of interesting because the top percentage of some of these online personalities, I guess we'd call them personalities, an umbrella term, they're actually making more money than 90+% of Hollywood actors. Obviously, we're not talking about, the big megastars, but all those mid-range actors, there's YouTubers making more money. So now the next generation, instead of all these next generation wannabe superstars and actors and Hollywood stars, a lot of them are just turning to YouTube, not even necessarily from the comfort of their own home, but from the comfort of their own phone. I mean, you could do it just from school, from their home, of course, also anywhere outdoors, just randomly sitting somewhere, making content, making money, and getting famous, or in the hopes of getting famous. Because back in the day, you could even say there's a certain amount of gumption that can be respected, a certain amount of hustle that it took to actually, sell all your earthly possessions and make the pilgrimage to Hollywood, to LA, to try to make it as an actor while being, whatever, while being a waiter or a waitress. I mean, that's kind of the trope. There's something respectable about that on a certain level, but now all you have to do is hit record on your phone and you can make any content you want, depraved or not, in an effort to somehow gain some kind of notoriety and fame and shekels. So, that I believe all these factors culminate in the demise, but the last one I think is one of the major hits because Hollywood's really not what it used to be on many different levels. Now, you could argue the top 1%, yeah, sure, but there's really no middle ground anymore. See, back even in the 90s, even the early 2000s, you could scrape by a living being like a low-end actor, like not even in A-list movies, in B movies. There might be enough money and enough work to go around and slightly less competition. Now it's kind of insane because there's obviously still a ton of competition, but because there seems to be less money to go around in Hollywood, crazy inflation, and it's just so much easier to do social media for up-and-coming wannabe stars. They don't even necessarily, I mean, it's almost kind of weird. I wouldn't call it a positive thing because even if you weren't a good actor, there was still a pursuit of a craft. There was still acting technique. You're still trying to be good. Or if you're trying to be an action star, you're doing martial arts or whatever, or gunplay or sword play. It's very physical and you have to be talented and skilled. Whereas for social media, you just, do hot takes or comedy routines or, a whole bunch of other crazy, weird stuff, exploitative or not. And you could literally just do that right from the phone. And it really doesn't take any skill or talent. Not that there aren't skilled and talented people also doing that. Like there are some certain, fitness influencers or personalities that put in a ton of work and they're incredible athletes. And obviously, but that's not like 99%. Most of the internet's just littered with these talentless goofs trying to make it big. And in the past, before the social media option was there, they were kind of forced. They were forced to put in some kind of work. Because even if you want to say most of those wannabe Hollywood stars are just coked up, losers, whatever, they were still trying. I mean, I've known people from back then. They were going to acting classes, whatever. I mean, maybe they weren't good. Maybe they, still partied a lot in LA, but there was still a pursuit of a craft there. There's something honorable about pursuing a craft and studying the technique and working hard at it, whether you make it or not. Now that's kind of gone. So for the most part, obviously there's exceptions. Obviously there's certain percentages, but those are my observations, and I don't see it getting any better. If anything, these big Tom Cruise movies like Top Gun, Mission Impossible, also notice that these are franchises with roots. They're not brand new. Notice that. They're not brand new. So, and even all these superhero movies, they're all soulless rehashes from characters that were created long ago in a time where artistic pursuits had soul. Another really important point, I think, and that is very relevant, is, of course, let's call it movie magic. Where has the magic of the movies gone? Now, this is more of a subconscious appeal, obviously, on MINDSHOCK. We look at everything logically. But part of looking at it logically is also understanding how the human mind works. So, only tangentially related is the willing suspension of disbelief, where you kind of get, you buy into the movie to a certain extent, both literally and figuratively, where you kind of suspend your disbelief and you're in the movie realistically, so to speak. Now, what does this also touch upon? CGI, yes, although obviously there were always special effects. A lot of people don't know this, particularly goofs who claim the moon landing had to be real because they didn't have special effects back in the 60s, which of course they did. They actually had projection-based effects, and if you look up the history of chroma keys, like blue screen, green screen, obviously much more basic and rudimentary, but the beginnings of those technologies were being utilized pretty much from the very advent of the film camera. So you're looking right around 1900, they were already utilizing these effects, and by 1920, 1930, 1940, there was already a decent amount of progress. Now, you have to keep in mind, obviously, the context of time, because at the time, even some of those old horror movies that people will laugh at today, a large percentage of the population thought that was scary back then simply because that was all there was. So it was realistic in a sense that compared to anything else, it didn't seem hokey. Now, I'm sure you could cherry pick some examples maybe at the time that were hokey, but in general, movie-going audiences who experience what? In Americana, 1950s or whatever, like what is there to compare to? There aren't these high-end video games. I mean, makeup and special effects aren't really that far advanced in terms of horror, like prosthetic masks and all that look super realistic, monsters and space aliens and all that. I mean, there were comic books. So next to comic books, regardless of how basic some of these movie special effects were, they were still more than enough to terrify audience, which is why they were so popular. People went to see them. This was before the so bad it's good genre. Although some of them at the time were appraised at a certain value of realism, and decades after they entered the so bad it's good category. But, post, I guess you could say 80s, at some point in the 80s, movies were being made specifically already to be in the so bad it's good category, or if they weren't, they turned out to be right away. So when factoring all that, let's appeal to the subconscious. And this has to do with demographics as well, because, for example, the male audience, I mean, a lot of guys, particularly logical guys, older guys, they don't really watch all the garbage coming out of Hollywood today. I won't get into the whole woke agenda and all that nonsense, but force feeding propaganda, political or otherwise, I mean, that's just a bad look. Anybody with a brain is not going to want to, dish out hard earned cash to go see what might be good in a production design, in the way of production design, but just or even if it is a good story, just that force fed propaganda. Now, what some people could argue that was always done. Operation Mockingbird, and even prior to government forces infiltrating Hollywood in all forms of media. Yeah, but it wasn't so heavy handed. And that's where it's at, because you could still enjoy some of these older action movies where either there was no propaganda at all, or it was light enough as to not, basically not be force fed. Now, pretty much any big budget Hollywood movie, there's gonna be some kind of propaganda force fed. Not subliminal, force fed in your face. And the other thing alienating male audiences is, of course, kind of like the manufactured, feminist propaganda. Now, before all the goofs get triggered at that, there were always female heroes. Some of them, I mean, just the most hardcore, you could even argue misogynists, they're big fans of the Alien movies. Aliens, Ripley. They're big fans of Sarah Connor, the Terminator movies. There were all of these kind of, what can we call them, organic female heroes. Where, I mean, even Red Sonja with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Bridget Nielsen, even she, I mean, some people can say that's hokey, whatever. But even that didn't seem force-fed. The manliest of men could enjoy those movies. And before all the goofs get triggered with all of the woke nonsense, I mean, there were just big screen heroes like Bruce Lee, who's still one of the biggest stars of all time. I mean, you could argue, of course, that there was some kind of discrimination on some level everywhere at all times and continues to this day and always was around back then. Yeah, sure. But clearly it wasn't so. They like to throw around the term institutional. Clearly, it wasn't institutional because you had all these awesome, so-called traditional skin tone people that were just, dominating. Even in Bruce Lee's era, his contemporary Jim Kelly, a lot of people were fans of Jim Kelly, Fred Williamson, all those guys. And then you have goofs coming out of the woodwork today saying that, there were none of these heroes back then. Not only were they around, but they were way more organic and relatable to everyone, and it wasn't force-fed propagandist nonsense down your throat. It also kind of helped that the people making the movies were actually passionate about them and not just cashing a paycheck for the most part. But yeah, even Cynthia Rothrock, nobody wants to talk about Cynthia Rothrock. I mean, it's kind of hard not to put her like kind of number one. I mean, it's hard not to rank Cynthia Rothrock as number one in terms of an action heroine. I mean, she's probably the number one female action star of all time. Some people say, she did low budget stuff. Yeah, so what? I mean, her resume speaks for itself. Both in the Hong Kong film industry with crazy stunt works where she mostly, I actually believe she did most of her own stunts, a large percentage. And for those that don't know, Jackie Chan actually did not do all his own stunts. I mean, he did a lot of big ones. He did a lot of life-threatening ones. But there's both a combination. Maybe I'll do a dedicated video on that if people are interested, because it was actually one of the first topics I logically analyzed way back in the day, because he was on all these talk shows talking about how he does all of his own stunts. Now, people give him credit, and rightfully so, because he does do a lot of death-defying stunts that he's been injured on and almost died on. Yeah, he did all of them. There's also big stunts that he did not do. He did most of the big ones. He probably did just about every big stunt. And the other caveat is, even when he did a stunt, if they were doing multiple takes, he did one or two of them, and another stunt guy did one or two of them. So they both did the stunts. But in other cases, he did cheap out. And if it was like a really high fall, a different stunt guy did the whole fall, and then he would still do it. but he would do it off a slightly lower elevation, still enough to kill yourself. But, it is what it is. If you're being logical, objective, and neutral, you're going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And what's also kind of strange is that there were smaller, super easy stunts that he didn't do, or he would do them for one movie, but the same stunt he wouldn't do for another movie. So, yeah. And by the way, the name of the stunt guy that did, for the people that think this is all made up, it's a guy named Johnny Chung. I don't even recall the book. Was that Bay Logan? I don't even remember. There was a book that I think specifically addressed this, and Johnny Chung actually did a bulk of Jackie Chan's stunts. Again, some of which Jackie also did, but Johnny Chung did a lot of ones that Jackie was credited for. And he's a really good martial arts stunt guy in his own right. I mean, just very, very phenomenal. Doesn't get any credit, but yeah, hopefully he was at least well compensated. So yeah, I think Cynthia Rothrock might have even done a higher percentage of her stunts than Jackie Chan even did, but probably similar. Just the bulk she did herself. So yeah, she doesn't get the credit she deserves, but definitely one of the all-time greats. So where am I going with all this? That was a little bit of a tangent, but here's the point. When you're watching some of these old school action stars, I mean, even a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger, I mean, he did some stunts as well. The level of danger and realism, it falls under the umbrella of the willing suspension of disbelief, because they're still doing it even though it's a movie. Like, even with explosions, like a lot of Stallone movies, that's a real explosion in the background. Now, yeah, maybe they're not right next to it, although sometimes they actually are and even got injured. Some movie stars did. But even though it's fake under the umbrella of fiction, it was still done for real. So there's still that element of danger. You're seeing real fire, real explosives, real stunts, real jumps, real car crashes. Whereas what happened post-2000s, post-2010s, everything's done on a green screen studio now. It's all special effects. So even though obviously it was a fictional movie and everything was known, even that realm of danger, of real danger, it's not there. So whether people realize that, or it's just more of a subconscious background realization, there's a certain level of excitement that just doesn't exist anymore. And it's almost like a jumping the shark moment. I mean, we could even, not to pick on the Fast and the Furious series, but you could say, I don't remember the exact numbers. I should probably do a dedicated podcast on the entire series, just because that is such a bonkers movie series that started off with dramatic underground street racing and modifying cars to just the most outlandish, over-the-top Hollywood action franchise that basically became a parody of itself, even going into space. I mean, literally, like, it's so insane to just kind of examine that series. But we could say one of the jumping the shark moments, I don't know if maybe it was 7 that's sticking out to me. That highway sequence in 7, where just all realism went out the door, but they didn't shoot it. It wasn't real anyway. Like in the first movie, so that would have been, 2000, 2001, somewhere around there. In the second movie, they rig stunts. I mean, they have cables and they're rigging the stunts, but they're still technically doing it for real out on the road. Whereas with the new, everything's all green screen for them. All the big stuff, all the really insane stuff is all green screen, tanks, helicopters, all this stuff. It's all fake. So that level of danger and excitement, it's just not there. It just becomes bland to a certain extent. Now, when special effects first got going, like even 300, I would say 300 is probably the tail end of where it could theoretically still work. And that's for a whole different other set of reasons, obviously, where it's kind of like a comic book fantasy historical. I mean, it's got its own thing going on where it's not like it's a modern day story set today. But another good example is actually Braveheart, where everything is practical effects. There are no CGI people. I think Lord of the Rings is one of the greatest fantasy series of all time. But there aren't CGI armies. It's all real. So it kind of just draws you in more. It's kind of like where there's a certain amount of realism in the art, where there's a certain amount of investment by the audience that just cannot be achieved with pure CGI. So with some of when CGI was first starting to be used heavily in some of these movies, and there's another argument to be made that comic book movies basically just ruined all of Hollywood cinema, because it was just how to outdo itself. Oh, make the CGI look so good, it's so realistic, which it did kind of get to that point, because some of that first round of comic book movies in the, I don't know, 2000s to 2010s, it didn't really look that great. It took you out of the movie. But moving closer to 2020, I mean, it looked, they really did get to a point where it looks very, 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 very good. It looks realistic. But again, that emotional investment is just not there because it's all fake. So to round that all out, when everything kind of moved in that direction, and you can kind of prove this to a certain extent with Tom Cruise movies, because with the Mission Impossible movies, Tom Cruise still, and even the last Top Gun movie, it's kind of real. Now, if you don't know it's real, you might assume it's all CG. I mean, they were making their own cameras to put in the fighter jets and all that for Top Gun Maverick. But the Mission Impossible movies, that just level of realism and danger, it's real, and you're subconscious on a subconscious level. I don't know about the younger generation, because they grew up playing all these video games with incredible graphics, so their brain might not even work in this way where their subconscious can recognize this. But for people older than maybe 30 or 40, they would definitely understand everything I'm talking about, and that demographic has kind of left the movie-going demographic, other than kind of coming out for some of these random movies, which a certain percentage doesn't even do that. Maybe they don't even know or care to know. But it has been argued, I don't know if it was Steven Spielberg, who I don't have any positive things to say, but was he the one who said that Tom Cruise kind of single-handedly kept the industry alive? But Tom Cruise is one man, and he's not getting younger. And Hollywood's definitely going down the toilet. So how much longer can he keep this up with all the comic book movies bringing everything down? And even Tom Cruise, I mean, he did that one Mummy movie, which was kind of weird, with Russell Crowe. I mean, it was kind of a weird movie. You wouldn't even expect him in that kind of movie. So obviously there was special effects there, but again, there's also a reason people don't really name that movie when talking about their favorite Tom Cruise movies. But yeah, I think that's an element that just really, really accounts for a lot. I'm not going to say it accounts for more than streaming or any of that. I just wanted to address the movie magic kind of being gone. The magic is gone. Is that really just what the main downfall of Hollywood is about? I mean, yeah, there's financial reasons that facilitated that. There's technological reasons that account for that as well, through high-speed internet, special effects in movies. But does it all really boil down to the magic of movies simply having been evaporated? Doesn't mean there aren't some gems here and there, but for the most part, the industry as a whole. And look at the quality across the board. I mean, just pick a random year, 80s, 90s, all the way up to 2000, 2001. I mean, there were just dozens and dozens of quality films, or at least entertaining films. Now, what do you got? I mean, it's like literally a small, tiny handful of movies that are even passable or decent in any way, and then everything else is just schlock garbage. Pretentious, propaganda shoving. I mean, just sheer nonsense across the board, where everything just kind of seemed more organic, both in making action stars, instead of kind of force feeding these clearly unqualified, unrealistic, and most of which aren't even good dramatic actors in any way, but having them do just these highly physical roles, or action movie or comic book hero roles. I think I just think that the subconscious mind, just through basic survival instinct that is present in every living being, when you see some of these stars, both male and female, paraded around like they're legitimate action stars or action heroes, it is so laughable. I think even small children, at least on a subconscious level, they can't take that seriously. So there's just no way they can even if they watch the movies, it's just again that magic is gone because it doesn't work. Now you could take a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger, a bodybuilder. I mean, yeah, he was in the military, but it's not like Arnold Schwarzenegger is the most skilled soldier or the greatest martial arts master of all time. It just you don't need to buy that because he's so physically imposing. Or with Bruce Lee, like how can you argue? I mean, his blinding speed. I know a lot of people think he's not a real fighter, et cetera, et cetera. Even though he's actually had legitimate boxing matches, tournaments that he actually won in boxing. If you haven't checked out the Bruce Lee podcast on MINDSHOCK, check that out. And he's had, again, supposedly dozens and dozens of street fights, some of which might have been to the death. If that is true, would you expect him to talk about it? Obviously not. But anyway, I'm not alleging it is true, just the rumor mill in Hong Kong, of course. But it's kind of hard to, even I've gotten into street fights as a kid, and I didn't live anywhere near, a place like Hong Kong. So to think that it's impossible that he's gotten into a bunch of real fights, that, I don't know. Goofs are going to goof. But yeah, you had all of these older action stars from decades ago. There was a certain amount of believability. Like even Stallone's obviously is not going to be a heavyweight boxing champ. Stallone's obviously not going to be, like a Navy SEAL Rambo type guy. Although after doing all the movies, I mean, obviously he's got some kind of training, but it's not about that. It's about some kind of air of believability, some kind of base for that believability. Whereas look at all of these actors playing superheroes and all that. There's nothing. There's no believability there. And something else that's kind of been brought up on the psychological side is the nature of films before this whole comic book boom. Or you could even argue in the 90s they kind of started putting, I mean, I guess they've always done it on a small scale, but they really ramped up putting non-action guys or non-action gals in these action roles, which obviously doesn't work. But in the past, there was also this, the montages. People make fun of it in the 80s, very popular. I mean, a lot of 90s movies too. They just had these training montages where you have to work to be good at something. But now part of this is trophy generation. I mean, we're examining all aspects of the fall of Hollywood here. Part of this is the recent participation trophy generation. And also just this air of entitlement that the younger generation has where you don't really have to work for anything. It'll be handed to you. And if it's not, you just play the victim Olympics and pretend there was some kind of discrimination because it wasn't handed to you, or some kind of whatever, not discrimination, but some other factor where you're the victim no matter what. And the answer is never to train and work harder. Because and look at the movies of old. Even especially sports movies, there were always unfair situations. I mean, let's drop some blood sport up in here with Jean-Claude Van Damme, one of the greatest pieces of cinema in the history of mankind. I don't want to ruin it, but there's some cheating going on in the finale. Is it about overcoming for those? I mean, are there people who haven't seen the movie Bloodsport? All of these participation trophy generation kids, they might not have. But not just that movie, but in all of these types of movies, action movies, sports movies, the world is not fair. Everybody kind of knows that. Instead of playing the victim Olympics, you could train harder to overcome the unfairness, build your character so that you become that much better for it. And then you can overcome even more and then help others overcome. And this kind of underlying message of positivity and just this message of working hard and achieving in spite of all the unfairness, that got lost along the way. You could actually kind of say maybe The Matrix is a little bit guilty of this. I know a lot of Matrix fans out there, and rightfully so, on the conspiratorial philosophical angle. But in terms of, like, in a way, it's sort of a superhero movie as well, where you have all these abilities, real world versus fake world. Not that he didn't train for it, but the training is kind of like, plug in, do a couple sessions, video game style. It's not years and years and decades of grueling training work. Whereas, I mean, you could make fun of Arnold Schwarzenegger for doing steroids all you want. Even with steroids, all the guys were doing steroids. How many of them had the body that he had? The amount of work that it took, I mean, you just can't take away the amount of work, and they just capitalized on it. Like, even athletes, even guys like Brian Buzzworth, the Buzz, an NFL player who just tried to be an action star with the cult classic Stone Cold. I think that was 1991. There was still a better air of believability than I don't know, watching some of anything coming out recently, like Spider-Man movies or whatever, with these frail so-called actors from Hollywood. There's just no believability there. But even with Brian Bosworth, I mean, at least he's kind of a tough guy. I mean, it's not easy getting into the NFL. He's an athlete, all this training. I think that air of believability, where it still worked with movie magic. Now, I mean, nothing works. I mean, everything is just propagandized woke nonsense. Nobody's buying it. I mean, even Tom Cruise is getting kind of old. All the stunts might be practical stunts, so that's cool. But on a certain level, even Tom Cruise doesn't quite pass the test. Although you could say just his movie star persona kind of makes it work. And he's also kind of been at it forever, to the point of, and doing a lot of the training. In Mission Impossible 2, like, he actually told the stunt guy to, especially in that opening climbing sequence, that's pretty crazy. I think the insurance company made him use the stunt guy, but he actually waved the stunt guy off as much as possible. There was only, like, I think 1 or 2 things that he didn't do. So, yeah, it's, he's kind of earned his stripes, so to speak, in that regard. But just going over all these factors, I think we kind of covered it on the downfall of Hollywood. Can there be a recovery? I mean, the other problem, again, everything is rehashed garbage. You're just where are all the new ideas? Now, obviously, you could say, oh, well, that's what you go to indie cinema for. Yeah, but we're talking about Hollywood here. Obviously, the film medium is never dead, and I don't think it'll ever be dead. There's just too many creative people out there on the indie side, in foreign films. But as far as American Hollywood, is there a way to recover? And the final point we'll go over here is just the corruption. It's always been rampant, but now that it's becoming more and more exposed, just all the abuse going on in Hollywood. I mean, everybody, it's the word the phrase open secret was thrown around for so long for insiders, but people on the outside didn't know. Well, now they know. How many parents still want their kids to be Disney stars after watching the last decade unfold, or even 2 decades now? I mean, what kind of parent wants their kid to have anything to do with Hollywood at this point, now that it's all known? Again, it really seems like the magic has just fizzled out on every level. Is there a way back for Hollywood? I don't know. I mean, the only real way would probably to be clean slated. You'd have to arrest all these scum. You'd have to have you'd have to have brand new studios with no history, and then they could build reputations of integrity. So yeah, I mean, you'd pretty much have to burn it all to the ground, and it's a decaying house. I don't know if you could save it. Even if the foundation is half decent, the walls are gone, the floors and ceiling are gone, the roof's been gone. You're gonna have to pretty much knock it down and build something new, build something good. That's really the only way to have it be solid in any way. So that's my take on it. Obviously, all the MindShock listeners out there, feel free to leave your thoughts, theories, opinions, rebuttals, or debunkings of anything presented in the comment section. If you want to help support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel that way. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.